Reading graphs, positive, negative, increasing, and decreasing. In this video, we're only going to focus on reading a graph where it's positive and negative. So the first thing we're going to talk about is writing intervals and inequalities and being able to interpret both. So in words on this first example, when it says x is greater than 2, so the inequality, as you can see here, x is greater than 2. As an interval, it's going to look like this. If x is greater than 2, so think about as far as in terms of if that's going to go to infinity or negative infinity. Well, what's greater than 2? Is infinity greater than 2 or is negative infinity greater than 2? Well, hopefully you're thinking infinity is greater than 2. So you would put 2 to infinity. When you write it as an interval, your smaller number will always go on the left and your larger number will always go on the right. Always. You'll always put parentheses with inequalities that are less than and greater than. Brackets will always be used with the equal to when it has the equal to symbol, like less than equal to or greater than equal to. And like I mentioned in our last video, you will always use parentheses with infinity and negative infinity. So for B, x is less than or equal to 5. Okay, so you want to think, okay, if it's less than or equal to 5, is negative infinity less than or equal to 5, or is positive infinity less than or equal to 5? So negative infinity is less than or equal to 5. So negative infinity is the smallest number you can get. Negative infinity will always come first. You will always put negative infinity first before anything. So you will put negative infinity, then you will put 5 with a bracket. And you can mix up, like in this one, you can put parentheses and brackets within the same problem. Okay, so x is between 0 and 4. So on this one, I give you the interval notation, and we're going to write the inequality. So when it's like this, we're going to put x in the middle, and you're going to put a 0 and 4. And on these, sometimes I think these are the easiest because your inequalities, when it's a compound inequality like this, inequalities are always going to point to the left, always. And so now all you have to decide is it underlined or is it just like this? Well, since you have parentheses, they are not underlined. The only time you underline them is when you have a bracket. So on D, x is greater than or equal to negative 1. So x is greater than or equal to negative 1. And that's what our interval says. Okay, x is less than negative 8. So x is less than negative 8. So as an interval, in interval notation, if it's less than, we're talking about negative infinity. And remember I said negative infinity will always come first. And then we put negative 8. Since there's no equal to sign, we use parentheses. Okay, x is less than 2, but greater than 1. Okay, so that means it's a compound inequality. So I'm going to put x in the middle. You'll always put your numbers in order. So since negative 1 is our smaller number, put negative 1 first, put 2. And so that's how I think about it because everything always has to be in order. It's less than 2, but greater than 1. Notice there's no equal. It says nothing about being equal in there. So I know that my equals or my inequalities, my inequalities are not going to be underlined. So it's going to look like this. And now my interval notation, whoops, didn't mean to do that one first here. My interval notation is going to be the same way. You always put your smaller number first. It's always in numerical order. And since there's no equal to, there are no brackets. You only use brackets when it says something about being equal to. Now, a graph is positive when it is above the x-axis, okay? And then here's another way, f of x is greater than 0. That means positive. Greater than 0 is positive. So when it's above the axis, so here this is where it starts being positive. It's above the x-axis here. So it's above the x-axis from here, and it keeps going up. So we would say that it's above the x-axis. This little spot right here is where it starts to be positive, and it's positive all the way from here, and it keeps going up forever. It runs off the graph. Even though there's not an arrow there, we're going to assume that it keeps going up forever. But this little spot right here in between these 2 points, and we're going to say that this is at about 1.5. This is where it starts going, or sorry, negative 1.5. That's where it starts going positive. So interval notation, it starts at 1.5 and it's going to infinity. An inequality would be x is greater than negative 1.5. Because it's at 0, it's on the line at 0 right there. So we can't say that it's equal to, because it's not positive on that point, on the line, because on the line it's at 0, which 0 is not positive or negative. Okay? Now, where is it negative? Moving on to the next one. So it's negative here. This is where the graph is negative because it's below the x-axis. That's where it's negative. It's below the x-axis. That's where it's negative. So it starts being negative from here, and it's going this direction. It's negative from here. So it's negative from negative 1.5, and it's going negative this direction. So interval notation, we would say from negative infinity to negative 1.5, and we would say x is less than negative 1.5. So a graph is negative when it's below the axis. A graph is positive when it's above the axis. Now, what I would like for you to do now to help you get more familiar with this, there is an activity. Whoops, I meant to do my highlighter. There's an activity. If you go, if you pause the video, there is going to be a link right below this video that will take you to Khan Academy, and there will be 4 questions that I want you to do. So stop after the 4 questions, do the 4 questions, and then stop after the 4 questions, and then you can pick back up with notes. And it's just going to help you get more familiar with being positive and negative. Stop after the 4 questions. There's more questions in Khan Academy that will go along with these notes, but I only want you to do the first 4 questions, and then you can pick back up with watching these notes. Okay, so hopefully you've done the 4 questions in Khan Academy. And now what we're going to do is we're going to determine where our graph f of x is greater than 0, which also means this is just a fancy way of saying where our graph is positive. Be able to read this in both ways. They may not always come right out and say positive. They may word it like this, which just means positive. So we're looking where our graph is positive. So on A, where is our graph positive? Where is it above the x-axis? So here's our x-axis. Here is our graph. Is this graph above the x-axis? Hopefully you said no. So on A, this graph is not positive. This was kind of a trick question on our first one. This graph is not positive. So we would not, there's no interval notation or inequality on this one. This one's not positive. Okay, so on our second one here, it's positive from here, and it stops being positive right here. Now, this is close enough. We're just going to say that we're going to say this is at 2, okay? And it runs off the graph, so we're going to say it keeps going forever. It's going from negative infinity to 2. So interval notation from negative infinity to 2, from left to right. And as an inequality, we would say x is less than 2. Okay? So there's B. Now for C, it's positive in 2 places. It's positive from here to here. Okay? So 0 to 2. So let's go ahead and write this one. So 0 to 2. And if we write this as an inequality, we would do 0 is less than x is less than 2. And it's also positive from here to here, 4 to 6. So 4 to 6. And we would do our inequality like this, because it's between 2 numbers. And we would use parentheses because at 4, it's not really positive or negative because it's on the axis. And on the axis is equal to 0. And 0 is not positive or negative. Okay, so if it wasn't on the axis, we would be using brackets. Okay, so in example 3, we're going to use... All right, so on these, what we're doing is we're using Desmos to tell where the graph is negative, okay? So where f of x is less than 0. So remember, that's just a fancy way of saying where it is negative, okay? And it wants you to go into Desmos. So you have to go to Desmos and type in this equation. So if we go to Desmos, and I've already got mine typed in. So here's our first graph. We'll zoom in. So our first graph is x plus 2 squared minus 4. So I just have my first graph entered. And if we do where it's negative, so it's negative from negative 4 to 0. That's where it's negative. Negative 4 to 0. You're looking at the x values. So negative 4 to 0. That's an interval notation. And if you write it as an equality, we would do negative 4. I didn't mean to do a parentheses there. Whoops. Well, let me start over here. Negative 4 to 0. So ignore that. So there's your inequality. All right. So then looking at B, our square root graph. So let me turn this graph on. So this is the next graph that we're looking at. So it is negative from negative 3. And if we go over and look where it starts turning positive, negative 3 to right here, it's 61. Negative 3 to 61, so that's where it starts to turn positive. Now, at 61, that's where it starts to turn positive. That's going to be parentheses. But if we go back here, at negative 3, it is clearly negative. It is under the x-axis. So negative 3 is a bracket. Whoops, I almost messed up. Negative 3 is a bracket to 61. And when we write that as an inequality, it's going to look like this. Okay? So then for our next one, this is what our next graph looks like. So we're going to focus on this section down here. This is where it's negative. So it's negative from negative infinity because it's going to the left forever. And it gets really close to 0 in this section over here. It's not ever going to cross this axis. You can see where I'm moving the point, where it's going down. So from negative infinity to 0. So negative infinity to 0, and as an inequality, that's going to be x is less than 0. And for our last problem, we'll turn this graph off and this graph on. This graph is not negative, it's all positive. You can see as we move it, it's getting really close, and if I zoom in, you can see that it's super close to that axis, but it's never going to go below that axis. So this graph is not negative. So there's not a way to write that. It's not negative. Okay, so this one, it made you go graph it in Desmos yourself, and then you had to list out where it was negative.